On the morning of February 19, 1945, a Marine corporal stepped onto volcanic black sand carrying a weapon that did not exist in any manual, any depot inventory, any official record of the United States military. Within hours, that weapon would kill more enemy soldiers than entire squads could account for. Within days, the man who carried it would be dead. And within weeks, every trace of the weapon itself would vanish from the earth, as if it had never been forged at all. This is the story of what happens when a toolmaker from Ohio decides that the tools of war are insufficient, and that survival demands something the regulations never imagined. Tony Stein was born in Dayton, Ohio, in 1921, into a world still recovering from one war and sleepwalking toward another. His childhood was unremarkable in the way that many American childhoods were unremarkable during the Depression, shaped by scarcity and the understanding that comfort was never guaranteed. He left school early, not out of rebellion but necessity, and found work in the trade that would define him long before any battle ever could. He became a toolmaker, and in that profession he learned something fundamental about the relationship between problem and solution. A toolmaker does not accept that something cannot be done. A toolmaker asks what can be made to work. Dayton in the 1930s was a city of industrial pragmatism, where the Wright brothers had once turned bicycles into flight, and where factories hummed with the production of parts for machines whose purposes were not always disclosed. Stein worked with metal, with precision instruments, with the incremental adjustments that separated functional from flawed. His hands learned to read tolerance and tension. He understood that every mechanism had a logic, and that logic could be altered if you understood the forces at play. This was not theoretical knowledge. This was the kind of understanding that came from filing down a component 1/1000th of an inch at a time until a fit became perfect. He was not tall, but he was powerful in the way that men who work with their hands are powerful, compact, and efficient. He won the Dayton Golden Gloves as a welterweight, which meant he understood violence not as chaos, but as a series of calculated decisions made faster than thought. Boxing taught him to manage fear, to move toward harm rather than away from it, and to recognize the small openings that determine whether you survive or do not. On a summer afternoon in Dayton, he pulled a drowning boy from the water, an act that earned him no decoration, but revealed something about the instinct that would later drive him across a beach under machine gun fire to carry wounded men back to safety. He did not deliberate. He saw what needed to be done, and he did it. In 1942, as the war consumed Europe and the Pacific, and it became clear that America would not be spared, Stein enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve. He was 21 years old. He could have waited for the draft. He could have leveraged his tool-making skills into a stateside assignment, building the weapons others would carry. He did not. He volunteered for the Paramarines, an elite unit designed for rapid deployment behind enemy lines, and the training that followed was designed to eliminate anyone who hesitated. It did not eliminate Tony Stein. The jungle campaigns of the Pacific were not fought the way planners in Washington had envisioned. The terrain swallowed entire battalions. The heat turned rifles into branding irons. The enemy did not mass for conventional engagements, but vanished into vegetation so dense that a man could pass within 5 feet of an enemy position and never see it. Machine guns, the backbone of suppressive fire doctrine, proved too heavy and too slow to traverse through mud and root systems and volcanic rock. The Browning M1919 standard issue weighed 31 pounds without its tripod. In the jungle, that weight was catastrophic. By the time you set it up, the enemy had moved. By the time you moved it, you were exhausted. Stein watched men die because the weapons they carried were designed for a different war. He watched suppression fail because the guns could not be moved fast enough. And because he was a toolmaker, he did not accept that this was inevitable. He understood that the problem was not firepower but portability, not lethality but deployment speed. Somewhere in the progression from one campaign to the next, he began thinking about aircraft machine guns. They fired the same .30 caliber ammunition as the Browning 1919. They fired faster, up to 1,200 rounds per minute. They were lighter because they did not need the same heat dispersion systems as ground weapons, relying instead on airflow at altitude. And they were everywhere, salvaged from wrecked planes, sitting in depot yards, waiting to be repurposed or discarded. The idea did not belong to Stein alone. It belonged to the collective desperation of men who had seen doctrine fail. Sergeant Melvin Grevich and Private First Class John Little were the primary architects, but Stein was the fabricator, the man whose hands could take an AN-M2 aircraft machine gun and make it functional for a man on foot. They cut down the barrel. They adapted an M1 Garand stock. They fitted a bipod salvaged from a Browning automatic rifle. They fabricated a custom trigger assembly, because the original firing mechanism required electrical solenoids that did not exist outside of an aircraft. What emerged was a weapon that weighed approximately 25 pounds, fired at a cyclic rate faster than anything an infantryman could carry, and had never been approved by any ordnance board in the history of the Corps. They called it the Stinger, and it was a violation of every regulation governing weapons modification. It had no serial number. It had no maintenance manual. It had no official existence. But it worked, and in the calculus of combat, functionality outweighed paperwork. Stein test-fired it in the jungle and understood immediately that he was holding something transformative. The rate of fire was so high that individual rounds blurred into a continuous stream of sound. The recoil was manageable because of the bipod and the weight distribution. The ammunition consumption was catastrophic, burning through belts in seconds, but that was a logistics problem, not a design flaw. If you could keep it fed, you could suppress an entire ridge line. By the time the 5th Marine Division began preparing for the assault on Iwo Jima, Stein had carried the Stinger through multiple engagements. It had proven itself. It had kept men alive. And so when the landing craft approached the black volcanic shores of that 8-square-mile island on the morning of February 19, 1945, Tony Stein stood in the bow with a weapon that should not have existed, preparing to step into a battle that should never have been necessary. Iwo Jima was not strategically significant because of its size or its resources. It was significant because of its location, 660 nautical miles from Tokyo, close enough that American bombers could use it as an emergency landing strip, and close enough that American fighters could escort those bombers all the way to the Japanese mainland. The island was an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and both sides understood that whoever controlled it controlled the future of the air war. The Japanese understood this so clearly that they had spent months turning the island into a fortress that defied every assumption about what defensive warfare could achieve. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was not a man given to sentiment or Bushido theatrics. He was a realist who had traveled to the United States before the war, who understood American industrial capacity, and who knew that Japan could not win a war of attrition. His strategy on Iwo Jima was not to win, but to make victory so costly that the American public would lose the will to continue. He abandoned the doctrine of defending the beaches. He pulled his forces inland and into the volcanic rock itself, constructing a network of tunnels and bunkers so extensive that the island became a single interconnected fortress. 16 miles of tunnels, pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, artillery positions hidden in caves that could fire and then withdraw before counter-battery fire arrived. Every approach was pre-sighted. Every meter of ground was covered by at least 2 firing positions. The island had been transformed into a machine designed for one purpose: to kill as many Americans as possible before it fell. The pre-invasion bombardment was the longest in the history of the Pacific War, 74 days of naval gunfire and aerial bombing, and it achieved almost nothing. The Japanese positions were too deep, too dispersed, too hardened. When the Marines landed, they would be landing into a killing field where every advantage belonged to the defender. The morning of February 19th was clear and cold. The landing craft churned through black water toward a beach that rose in terraces of volcanic ash, soft enough to swallow a man's boots to the ankle, steep enough that every step forward required twice the effort. The first waves hit the beach, and the silence was so absolute that some men believed the bombardment had worked, that the enemy had been destroyed or had withdrawn. They were wrong. Kuribayashi had ordered his forces to hold fire until the beach was crowded, until there were so many targets that every burst would find flesh. Tony Stein stepped off the landing craft onto Green Beach 1 carrying the Stinger, 25 pounds of unauthorized machinery, and 600 rounds of linked .30 caliber ammunition draped across his shoulders and chest. The weight was immense, but he had trained with it, had conditioned his body to move under that load, and he knew that the first moments on the beach would determine whether his squad survived or died. The volcanic sand absorbed sound in a way that was disorienting, muffling footsteps and shouts, and the silence persisted for seconds that felt like minutes. Then the island opened fire. The sound was not a sound but a physical force, a tearing of air, a cacophony of machine guns and rifles and mortars erupting from positions invisible against the black rock. Marines fell in clusters, cut down before they could orient themselves, before they could identify the source of the fire, before they understood that the enemy was not in front of them but above them, firing from caves and bunkers built into the terraces. The beach became a slaughterhouse. Men crawled forward through the ash, trying to find cover that did not exist, trying to return fire at positions they could not see. Stein dropped to one knee, planted the bipod, and opened fire. The Stinger roared to life with a sound unlike any standard infantry weapon, a high-pitched scream of metal on metal, 1,200 rounds per minute pouring out in a stream so dense that the tracer rounds looked like a solid line of light. He swept the weapon across the terrace ahead, walking fire into the cave mouths and the narrow firing slits of the pillboxes, not aiming at individual targets but saturating entire sectors with suppressive fire. The effect was immediate. The enemy fire from that sector slackened. The Marines near him surged forward, using the suppression to gain ground, and Stein moved with them, lifting the bipod, advancing 20 yards, planting again, firing again. The ammunition consumption was staggering. A 600-round belt lasted less than 30 seconds of sustained fire. Stein burned through his first belt before the squad had advanced 50 yards, and without hesitation, he signaled to the men behind him and began the first of what would become 8 separate runs back across the beach to resupply. Each run was a sprint through open ground under fire, back to the supply crates near the water's edge, loading fresh belts, and then sprinting forward again, back to the position where his squad was pinned, back to the weapon that had become the anchor of their survival. On the third run, he saw a Marine down in the ash, gut-shot trying to crawl toward the water. Stein did not hesitate. He dropped the ammunition belts, grabbed the Marine under the arms, and dragged him back toward the beach, moving at a crouch, the weight of the wounded man and his own exhaustion making every step a negotiation with gravity. He got the man to a corpsman, grabbed fresh ammunition, and ran forward again. He did this twice more, carrying wounded men out of the kill zone, returning each time to the Stinger, to the weapon that was keeping the advance alive. The pillboxes were the key terrain. They were reinforced concrete structures with firing slits barely wide enough for a barrel, positioned to cover every approach, and they were killing Marines faster than the advance could replace them. Stein identified a pillbox that was anchoring the enemy defense on his sector, a squat structure half buried in the volcanic rock, its firing slit glowing faintly with muzzle flashes. He moved toward it, not in a straight line but in a series of short rushes, using the terrain and the suppression from other Marines to close the distance. When he was within effective range, he planted the bipod and poured fire directly into the slit, sustained bursts that ricocheted inside the structure and forced the defenders to pull back from their firing ports. Then he lifted the weapon, ran forward, and threw a grenade through the slit. The explosion was muffled by the concrete, a dull thump, and then silence from that position. He moved to the next pillbox and repeated the process, and then the next. By the end of the first day, he had personally assaulted and neutralized multiple fortified positions, actions that in any previous battle would have required flamethrower teams or demolition squads, but which he accomplished with suppressive fire and grenades, and a refusal to accept that the fortifications were impenetrable. The cost was written on his body. His hands were burned from the heat of the barrel, blistered and cracked. His shoulders were raw from the weight of the ammunition belts and the recoil transmitted through the stock. His uniform was soaked with sweat and ash and the blood of the men he had carried. But the stinger had worked. It had provided fire superiority in situations where standard doctrine said fire superiority was impossible. It had allowed the Marines to move forward when movement should have been suicide. Over the following days, the battle devolved into a grinding attrition, yard by yard, bunker by bunker. Mount Suribachi loomed over the southern beaches, a hulking volcanic cone riddled with tunnels and artillery positions, and its capture became the symbolic and tactical objective of the first phase. Stein fought his way up the slopes, the stinger now a known factor among his unit, the weapon that men called for when they were pinned, the weapon that bought time and space and survival. On the slopes of Suribachi, Japanese fire from a concealed position caught Stein in the open. Shrapnel tore into his shoulder and side, fragments of volcanic rock and steel, and he went down hard. Corpsmen pulled him back, stabilized him, and evacuated him to a hospital ship offshore. The wounds were serious enough to justify rotation stateside. He had done more than any regulation required. He had earned rest. He refused it. As soon as the wounds were dressed and the bleeding controlled, he demanded to return to his unit. The doctors argued. He did not. Within days, he was back on the island, back with the 5th Marines, back with the Stinger. The weapon had no spare parts, no replacement components, and if it failed, it could not be repaired in the field. It continued to function because Stein maintained it obsessively, cleaning it in moments of lull, checking the feed mechanism, ensuring that the improvised trigger assembly had not loosened. The push north continued. Suribachi fell, and the iconic flag was raised, but the battle was nowhere near finished. The northern plateau was a landscape of nightmare, rocky ground honeycombed with tunnels, every ridge a fortress, every advance measured in bodies. Hill 362 Alpha was one of these ridges, an unremarkable piece of elevated ground that commanded the surrounding approaches and therefore had to be taken. On March 1, 1945, Stein's unit moved to assault the hill. The attack began before dawn, and the enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. Interlocking machine gun fire from hidden positions, mortar shells dropping with precision, rifle fire from caves that appeared and disappeared as defenders moved through the tunnel network. The Marines took casualties within minutes. The advance stalled. Stein moved forward with the Stinger, setting up suppressive fire, trying to identify the enemy positions through the smoke and dust. He poured fire into a cave mouth, walked fire along a ridge line, exhausted another ammunition belt and called for resupply. And then the enemy fire found him. Witnesses reported that he was hit multiple times, that he went down and did not move, that the position where he had been firing became the focus of concentrated enemy attention because the Stinger had been hurting them, had been the one weapon they could not ignore. Corpsmen tried to reach him, but the fire was too intense. By the time the position was secured, Tony Stein was dead. He was 24 years old. He had fought on Iwo Jima for 10 days. In that time, he had provided suppressive fire that enabled multiple advances, assaulted fortified positions that should have required dedicated assault teams, made 8 runs under fire to resupply ammunition, evacuated wounded men while carrying equipment that made him a priority target, and refused evacuation after being wounded so that he could return to the fight. The Stinger, the weapon that had made much of this possible, continued to be used by other Marines in his unit until it finally malfunctioned beyond field repair, and then it was discarded, left somewhere in the volcanic ash and blood-soaked earth of Iwo Jima. None of the original Stinger weapons survived the battle. They were never catalogued, never preserved, never studied by the ordnance boards that would later revolutionize infantry weapons doctrine. There are no photographs of Tony Stein holding the weapon. There are no technical diagrams. There is only the combat record, the citations, the testimony of the men who fought beside him and survived because he refused to accept that the weapons issued were sufficient. Stein was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the citation reading in part that he had displayed extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty, that his actions had been instrumental in securing the beachhead, and that his courage had inspired all who observed him. The medal was presented to his family in Dayton, and they accepted it with the grief and pride that families of the fallen carry for the rest of their lives. The question that persists is not whether Tony Stein was brave. The combat record settles that question definitively. The question is why the Stinger, a weapon that proved so effective in combat, was never adopted, never refined, never incorporated into the standard arsenal. The answer is bureaucratic but also doctrinal. The Marine Corps, like all military institutions, operates on systems of standardization. Weapons must be maintainable by armorers with standard training. Ammunition must be interchangeable. Supply chains must be predictable. A weapon that exists in only a handful of copies, constructed from salvaged parts, maintained by the intuition of a single toolmaker, cannot be scaled. It cannot be integrated. And so it was abandoned, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in a way that could not be replicated. But the concept did not die. The lessons of the Stinger, the understanding that suppressive fire required portability and rate of fire, influenced the development of weapons that came after. The M60 machine gun, introduced in the 1950s, was lighter and more portable than the Browning 1919. The M249 squad automatic weapon, introduced decades later, continued the evolution toward individual portable suppressive fire. The intellectual lineage runs from improvised weapons like the Stinger to the doctrine that now defines infantry combat. And that lineage exists because men like Tony Stein refused to accept that the tools they were given were the only tools that could exist. War is often described in terms of grand strategy, political objectives, the movement of armies across maps. But it is fought by individuals making decisions in fractions of seconds, under conditions where the regulations are irrelevant and survival depends on adaptation. Tony Stein understood this because he was a toolmaker before he was a Marine, and toolmakers understand that problems have solutions if you are willing to improvise, to take risks. To accept that perfection is the enemy of functional. He carried a weapon that did not exist in any manual, and with it, he kept men alive who would otherwise have died in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. He made repeated runs through open ground under fire because his weapon consumed ammunition faster than the supply system could sustain, and each run was a choice to accept risk for the sake of effectiveness. He refused evacuation after being wounded because he understood that the weapon he carried was irreplaceable, that no one else had trained with it as he had, and that his absence would cost lives. And on a rocky hill in the northern plateau of a small island in the Pacific, he was killed doing what he had done every day since the landing, providing fire that allowed other men to advance. The Stinger is gone. The battlefield has been reclaimed by memorials and quiet. The men who fought beside Tony Stein have mostly passed, and the memories they carried have passed with them. But the story persists because it illustrates something fundamental about the nature of courage and innovation under extreme conditions. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite fear, to move forward when every instinct screams to stay down, to carry wounded men when you are exhausted, to return to combat when you have earned the right to rest. Innovation is not the product of laboratories and controlled conditions. It is born from desperation, from the recognition that the tools available are insufficient and that survival demands something new. Tony Stein was not a general. He was not a tactician who shaped campaigns. He was a corporal who understood metal and mechanisms and what could be made to work if you were willing to ignore the regulations. He saw a problem, fabricated a solution, and used that solution to save lives until the day it could not save his own. That is not a story about heroism in the abstract. It is a story about what one person can accomplish when they refuse to accept that the situation is hopeless, when they see what needs to be done and they do it, regardless of the cost. The island of Iwo Jima was declared secure on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of combat. American casualties exceeded 26,000, including nearly 7,000 dead. Japanese casualties were over 18,000, with the vast majority killed in action. The island served its purpose, providing an emergency landing site for damaged bombers returning from raids on Japan, and it is estimated that the lives of over 24,000 American aircrew were saved because that landing strip existed. Whether those lives justified the cost of taking the island is a question that historians continue to debate, but for the men who fought there, the question was irrelevant. They were given an objective, and they achieved it, and many of them did not survive. Tony Stein is buried in a military cemetery, his name engraved on a headstone among thousands of others. The Medal of Honor citation is part of the public record, accessible to anyone who wishes to read it. But citations are dry documents, lists of actions and dates and outcomes. They do not convey the weight of the weapon, the heat of the volcanic ash, the sound of the stinger tearing through the air, the decision to run back across open ground one more time because the ammunition was gone and the squad was pinned. Those details exist only in the memories of the men who were there, and those memories have faded into history. What remains is the example, the demonstration that when the system fails, individuals can still make a difference. The regulations said that weapons must be standardized, that modifications were unauthorized, that a toolmaker corporal had no business fabricating a machine gun from aircraft parts. Tony Stein ignored those regulations because survival mattered more than compliance, and the men who fought beside him are alive today because he made that choice. This is not a story about technology. The Stinger was not a technological marvel. It was a crude adaptation, effective but temperamental, dependent on constant maintenance and an unsustainable rate of ammunition consumption. It worked because the man who carried it understood its limitations and adapted his tactics accordingly. This is a story about human decision-making under conditions where every choice has consequences and hesitation is fatal. It is a story about seeing a problem and refusing to accept that the problem is unsolvable. It is a story about carrying weight, both literal and moral, and continuing to move forward even when the weight becomes unbearable. The beaches of Iwo Jima are quiet now, black sand and memorial plaques, a place where tourists come to reflect on sacrifice and history. The pillboxes remain, concrete structures slowly eroding under the Pacific wind. The tunnels have been sealed. The volcanic rock holds no trace of the blood that soaked into it 80 years ago. But the story endures because stories are how we make sense of events that defy sense, how we extract meaning from chaos, how we remember the individuals who refused to be erased by the scale of the conflict they were caught within. Tony Stein did not set out to be a hero. He set out to survive and to help the men around him survive, and he recognized that survival required tools the system had not provided. So he built those tools and he used them, and he died using them. That is the entirety of the story, and it is enough. If you found this account worth your time, consider subscribing to this channel, where we work to preserve the stories of individuals who shaped history through actions rather than rhetoric. Leave a like if this story moved you, and share your thoughts in the comments. Here is a question worth considering as you reflect on what you have just heard. When the rules fail and survival depends on innovation, What are you willing to risk to create the solution that does not yet exist? Tony Stein answered that question with his life. How would you answer it with yours?